And we have one here, actually, prayer room. I bought a couple for the Sunday school a few years back. And I just encourage people, if you want to brush up on your Bible skills, to read it. You can borrow it from here. Preferably don't take it out of the center or even read it in the prayer room. But if anyone wants to buy their own copy, they're pretty easy to get, and I can order a few. But it was an excellent way to kind of know all the stories of the Bible, and gives you a really good foundation for the principle and kind of the explanation of the biblical families, right? And one thing I'll remember, Zach started reading the Bible, and then he made a comment and he said, "There's a lot of killing and death in the Bible." And my only response was, "Yeah, that's true. That's the way it is, right?" And we know that the reason for that is because, well, actually, that's just the reality of history, right? And even there, the picture Bible is kind of making it simpler than it actually was, right? And so, I think people, the Bible isn't, some people interpret the Bible as like a coded message from God, right? Or it's like God specifically is picking all these stories to try to teach people a lesson. But actually, the Bible is a lot more a story about people, right? About individual people and about families and groups of people, right? It's almost very much an education about history, right? An insight into history and how people interacted. And, I think one of the powerful things about the Bible is it really tries to show you reality, right? The reality of the things people struggle with. Real people overcoming real issues of the time, right? And oftentimes not really sugarcoating it, right? Just kind of bluntly explaining the kind of things people did at that time, right? And I think, when we read the Bible ourselves, when we read the principle, I think we can often forget, or we don't connect to these historical figures on a very personal level, right? There's a distance between us and them, right? And it's, okay, here's a story and here's something that happened and maybe this was the reason for it. But it's much harder to imagine ourselves in that situation, right? It's much harder and I think it's much harder to learn from their experience if we're not able to kind of connect on a deeper level. And I'll always remember a comment my brother once made about Abraham, right? Abraham does his 3 sacrifices and he fails, and that prolongs the providence according to the principle because he fell asleep. And my brother made a comment once. It was like, Abraham had to cut a cow with like not a really nice knife, but like a sharp rock, right? Like, of course he was tired. Like, that was an all-day sacrifice, right? It wasn't a like, I'll do this in the morning before lunch and then I'm just a little tired, I'm gonna take a nap. It was like all day he was focused on this offering. So it was really like a test of his endurance and his commitment. And, it was like a 24-hour prayer vigil almost, right? So it was such a fascinating comment when my brother said it, because I was like, yeah, I don't think I could spend all day cutting a cow with a sharp rock, right? Like, that is such a level of commitment, right? And potentially, it was kind of a life or death situation, right? Maybe the point is Abraham had to go past the point where he thought he would die, and maybe he stopped there. And that kind of fits into the theme that I want to share about Joseph's story, because Joseph's story is, it doesn't take a core part of the principle, right? It's much more more mentioned the theoretical, like models for Jesus's course, right? And unlike kind of Jacob and Esau and Abraham and Moses, we don't really go into Joseph's story in the Bible so much. But thinking on Joseph's story, it is quite a powerful story. And that's why I kind of want to share today. I think it's good to every now and then visit these historical figures and try to connect to them and understand them on a more personal level, because I really feel that's how we learn, how there's actually a learning from their story that can impact us and help us to grow and help us to understand God in a deeper way. And, the part that Zach read there is, for those, as you know, Jacob sent Joseph to check in on his brothers. He was like, brothers are off somewhere doing work. Go check up on them and come back and just let me know how they are. He was just worried about his children, right? And we don't know how old Joseph was, but he was probably at least a teenager, maybe even an adult. But obviously he had 10 older brothers, right? Because there was 12 sons overall, and the younger brother was born later, right? So Joseph goes to check on his brothers, and his brothers are so angry at him, right, that at least 9 of them really want to kill him, right? And the oldest brother, Reuben, tries to stop them. And he comes up with this idea, why don't we just throw him into a pit and leave him there? Because then, we don't kill our own brother, right? At least, we can just leave him there and then we don't have to worry about it. And obviously his plan was to go back and rescue, right? So again, even thinking from Reuben's point of view, this was probably a life or death situation for Reuben, because here's a mob and he's trying to change the attitude of the mob. And if he's too aggressive, they might turn on him and they might kill him, right? So, he's trying to do this kind of passive way of saving his brother. But of course, as we know, they put him into the pit. Reuben goes somewhere, and it turns out Judah comes up with this idea why don't we just sell him into slavery? And the interesting thing about that is Judah is the lineage, the chosen lineage for Jesus. So then the question is, did Judah do that because he didn't know Reuben's plan and he was trying to save his brother from just starving to death in a hole? So we don't know, but it's just, again, it's something to think about, because maybe Judah was also trying to save his brother and says, well, at least he'll live, right? Maybe he had this kind of attitude. Or maybe he didn't, maybe he just wanted to sell him in slavery. But my point is that there's a whole unwritten part of the Bible that's human relationships, right? And the other thing is, you have to think, when Joseph comes, he probably gets beat up pretty bad. Like, maybe not, but again, if you read between the lines, you kind of have a mob after him. And either way, whether he gets beat up or not, it must be an incredibly traumatic experience for him. It was kind of a life or death moment for Joseph, right? Where his brothers throw him into a hole and leave him there. And he doesn't know if he's going to live or die. He doesn't really know what's going on. Maybe he's very, very injured, right? And it's very interesting because it's a very common theme in the Bible about brothers wanting to kill each other, right? And I think this was one of the, when we learn about Cain and Abel, this is one of the first problems God was trying to resolve. He was trying to fix this kind of enmity between people, this hatred that lead to violence, right? And remember that all these boys, their father is Jacob, and Jacob is the first person to be able to actually win over the heart of his brother that wants to kill him, right? And so imagine what would happen if they had succeeded in killing Joseph. It probably overturns Jacob's success. It probably delays the providence even further, who knows how many years. So it's not just a life or death moment for Joseph. It's truly a pivotal point in the providence, right? Because again, this point has to be restored. It has to be healed. This willingness to hurt, people that are closest to you, right? And God is really trying to solve this problem. So Joseph sold into slavery, and because he's young and he's smart and he's healthy, he actually gets sold into a relatively easier kind of position, right? Remember, this is 2000 BC in Egypt. So potentially most slaves were put into manual labor to build the pyramids or statues or whatever. Most slaves were probably worked to death, right? So Joseph got very lucky in that sense that he was bought by the captain's guard, the captain of the guard of Pharaoh. And not only that, but because Joseph had, very good attitude, very good heart, was very loyal, had a lot of faith and worked very hard, he actually rose up to be kind of one of the leaders among the captain of the guard's slaves. But then, the next thing happened where the captain of the guard's wife accused him of attacking, right? And just because she tried to tempt him and he refused because he was loyal to the captain and also because he was a man of faith. And so she lied because she was upset. And if you think about it, that is also a life and death situation for Joseph, right? I'd say in 99.99% of cases, if the captain of the guard's wife told him that one of his slaves tried to attack her, that person's dead, right? And I wonder, how did Joseph survive? Why did he only end up in prison? And this is kind of his second life or death moment. And it must be because the captain of the guard had a certain level of respect for him or admiration. Like there must be something in that relationship. And again, you can think of it as a Cain and Abel relationship, a brother relationship, where something Joseph was doing or acting made the captain of the guard pause. And maybe he didn't believe his wife then. Maybe there was doubt, right? And so he let Joseph go to prison instead, right? And the reason I'm saying these things is, again, to kind of get back to the point about the Bible, we just kind of read the Bible, and it's almost like a series of stories. And sometimes we don't stop and try to really understand the human elements of those stories, right? And when you read Joseph's story, kind of just as a story in the Bible, literally as it is, and you have this kind of view of the Bible, the Christian view, then Joseph's story just reads as like, oh, because he was a man of faith, God always protected him, right? But it's important, I think, to understand the deeper level, the unwritten part of Joseph's story, right? Reuben kind of arguing with his brothers and convincing them not to kill him, right? What was Judah's motivation in trying to get his brother out of the hole and still live, right? So there's all these aspects. And again, the captain of the guard, I think, is an important element, because when I reread that, because Zach was reading, I was like, why did he let him live, right? It just kind of struck me, like there was something there, right? Some relationship, some connection through Joseph's actions. It wasn't just God protecting him and being lucky. It was through Joseph's actions that Joseph was protected. And jumping off the story of Joseph, because I think this is a very good example of what I mean about really understanding the underlying relationships in the Bible. When I'm giving Christians the purpose of the Messiah lecture, I always mention that Jesus had a father. And they're like, what do you mean? No, yeah, God. No, a physical father. Jesus had a physical father. Like, well, who was Jesus' physical father? And I'm like, it's so clear in the Bible that if you just, you will know in an instant when you read it, right? If you take a step back and don't read the Bible as some like fairy tale or story, and you read the Bible as if it's real people then there's no doubt. It's so clear. And you don't even have to read that much, because there's only 4 Gospels. 2 of them start with John the Baptist. So only 2 of them touch on his birth. And you only have to read till Jesus is born. Actually, you only have to read until Mary is pregnant, right? And then 100% success rate, they come back and they know who Jesus' father is, right? Because it's just that obvious. If you're reading the Bible as actual real people with real relationships, it's very, very obvious, right? And so I'm just saying, like, this practice of seeing the people in the Bible not as almost mythical figures, but real people with real relationships, I think is how we can really understand on a much deeper level how the providence was able to move forward, right? Joseph was able to move forward the providence because of his relationship with Reuben, where Reuben didn't hate him as much as the rest of his brother for whatever reason, right? Or maybe Judah had some relationship with Joseph or saw something deeper in Joseph than the rest of the brothers. And that saved his life. But that also moved God's providence forward because it was that heart that kept him alive. Same with the captain of the guard. Obviously, Joseph was able to win some part of the captain of the guard's heart, and it saved his life. And, then he went to prison. And this is not, our modern day prisons where there's human rights charters and there's a whole host of stuff to like protect people. There's 3 meals a day. There's, now you can even, they make sure you get exercise. This was 2000 BC, Egyptian civilization prison. And so his life was still at risk, right? And it was still it was probably much more similar to Father in Hunan than any modern day prison. And again, the Bible just kind of brushes over it. It says, he was respected in the prison and the guards gave him kind of a higher position over the other prisoners. But essentially what that means is that Joseph acted in such a way in prison that the guards protected him, right? The guards actually gave him a position so that he was protected, because I'm sure the survival rates in those prisons were not that high, right? And again, I'd say it would be closer to what people go through in modern day prison camps in communist countries, right, than what we would call prison. So again, I'd say this was his third kind of life and death situation, where he survived it not because God was protecting him, but because he was living according to God's will, right? Where he was living according to his faith and his beliefs, and his actions were restoring the fallen heart of men, right? He was able to love and forgive and able to win over the hearts of his brothers. And when I say his brothers, I mean the people around him, right? So then it comes to the really moving story when his brothers come back to him, right? And of course, it's important to remember that he didn't know that Reuben was trying to save his life. He didn't know that Judah was the one who suggested he be sold and slaves. So his last memory of his brothers was probably getting beat up to an inch of his life and thrown into a hole and then handed off to some slave traders, right? So when Joseph saw you have to remember, this is a very traumatic experience. And I think, again, it's important we don't underestimate that we really understand that Joseph was a person and he went through an incredibly traumatic experience when his brothers betrayed him, right? And he was in a position of power, and he was in a position where he could have done the same back to him, right? Back to all of them. He could have easily gotten revenge. He could have just said, "Oh, I'm your brother, and now I want my revenge, and you're all in prison," right? Like that's the kind of power and influence he had. But he wanted to give his brothers a second chance, right? He wanted to test them and see if they were still the same people who traumatized him, right? And again, that's really the story of Joseph that most people kind of connect to on some level. They kind of understand how Joseph was able to forgive his brothers. But I just want to point out it's so much deeper than just forgiving them, right? Or it was so hard to do. Right? It was such a traumatic experience, not to mention that there are many things potentially that Joseph experienced that were more traumatic because he was a slave, because he was in prison. Like there's no way to know the extent of what he suffered and what he went through. But it all kind of ties back to what his brothers did to him and their betrayal of him, right? So, I just want to emphasize that point. There was really deep trauma. It wasn't something that was easy to brush aside. It was kind of life-changing emotional impact that he had to kind of work through and manage through, right? And, when he finally kept testing his brothers and throwing one in prison and, threatening to kill them all, right? Like he really gave him a hard time, right? I think, again, when you just read the Bible, you're like, yeah, he's being a little harsh to him. It all worked out in the end, right? Now he's, one of the most powerful people in Egypt, but I think people forget that it was really traumatic for him, what they did to him, right? And it's something most people, if you convert that into today's world, what would be the equivalent? And could you forgive someone? Could you forgive a group of people that did something like that to you, right? So, it's very easy to be resentful. It's very easy to be resentful. And probably that's a natural thing, because in an ideal world, you wouldn't experience trauma and injustice, right? And so probably the reason it's so hard to release resentment is because it's so unnatural. Like you feel it so strongly because it's so against the intention of the way a person should be. You feel the injustice, right? So it's really hard to forgive, right? The old quote, to err is human, to forgive divine, right? And I think that really is almost embodied by Joseph's actions. So, at the end, he tested his brothers, and the things that, he held on to really help him forgive his brothers was his father, right? He loved his father, he missed his father, and he also knew that his father loved his brothers, right? So for him, that was something to stop him from just retaliating, right? Because he didn't want to hurt his father. And also there was the youngest brother. And the thing that moved his heart and was able to kind of heal his trauma was to see his older brothers protecting his younger brother, right? And that's how he could tell that they really changed. That's how he could be moved. But ultimately, Joseph's forgiving of his brothers, right, is very, very similar. It's kind of a continuation of Jacob's ability to win over Esau's heart, right? It's kind of like cementing in that providential line this ability to overcome this hatred that exists in the fallen world, this kind of anger and resentment that bubbles up and spills over into violence, right? And so, in conclusion, Joseph was a man in history whose faith gave him the strength and the power to heal real trauma. And not just his own trauma, but other people's trauma. And that's a very powerful attribute, right? That's how God moved the province forward, was through individuals who were capable of changing this paradigm, changing this way of thinking, changing this way of interacting with people, right? Because, in that time, again, going back to the general's wife, probably any man she tempted would be happy to take up the offer. And yet, here was one man who wasn't. And it made her angry, like it made her confused, right? She didn't understand why someone would do that, right? So all this stuff, like in the fallen world, people don't understand it till they see it. And so God had to so slowly find people who could be the example, who could kind of show people what it meant to forgive, to heal trauma, right? So, I picked the story just because Zach was so excited reading the Bible, and he asked me a lot of questions, and he said, I really want to read in front of everyone. So it wasn't my idea, just to be clear. It was Zach's idea. And, so it made me I wanted to pick a story from the Bible, and so I was kind of reading parts of it. And I really landed on Joseph, one, because he was so excited by it that one night, but also because I felt, Joseph was a person in history who sometimes is maybe underestimated, right? And again, the way the Bible is written and the way most Christians read it, it's like, oh, here's a story about faith. If you pray a lot, God will protect you. And I think that really underestimates what Joseph did, like how much personal heart and effort it took him to go through each of those steps, right? To survive each of those situations, right? I think there's a little bit of credit for Reuben, maybe potentially a little bit of credit for Judah. We'll have to see in spirit world in that scenario, right? But those are individual actions, right? And it comes back to this point in the principle that restoration is through individual responsibility and being able to kind of absorb trauma through love and to overcome trauma and to be able to heal trauma. And Joseph was a very traumatized person. And yet he was able to overcome that through his faith and his ability to love. And potentially, through his father's example, right? Remember that Jacob was the first person to do this. And that's why God chose Jacob's lineage, right? So yeah, I want to share that story. I feel like it's a really valuable exercise to remember, how the providence moves forward, because it's still moving forward. There's still plenty of trauma in the world that needs to be healed. And we need to emulate people like Joseph. We need to have this ability through our faith to be able to push past life or death situations, right? And to be able to then, through that example and through that heart and through that strength of our own faith and character, be able to heal the kind of resentment and confusion that exists in this world. So just a little bit of a tribute to Joseph today. I always think of this story whenever I meet a person named Joseph. If you know any Josephs around, remember that they're really named after a true hero of the providence, let's say. And hopefully we can also be heroes of the providence. And on that note, I'll offer a prayer and then we can have our closing song. Please join me in prayer. Sarang Manashin Hanu Bumanin. Today, I spoke a little bit about Joseph and his heart of love and faith to help him overcome the many life and death challenges he had in his life. And we're very lucky as we are today, because actually we rarely have to face life and death challenges. Although eventually all of us have to face the challenge of faith in the eternal afterlife. We have to face still the fallen world around us. So I pray we can learn from Joseph's example to be humble and to be centered on an absolute standard of faith, that no matter what happens, we still act as people who represent our Heavenly Parent. Very much reminded of also Father's attitude in Hum Nam, where people were really treated like animals and often acted like animals in response. And your Father kept the standard of acting like a dignified Son of God. So I pray whatever we do and wherever we go, whatever challenges we face, we can draw strength from the examples of history and the examples around us of people who put the standard of a son or daughter of God above all other struggles that they may face, all other challenges that came their way. So again, we can be so grateful that we live at this time in history. And even knowing there's so much work to do, we also know that a lot of the hardest, most difficult work has been done. So pray we can each focus on fulfilling our portions of responsibility. We can focus on healing pain in our own hearts and in our brothers and sisters' hearts, and really creating a chain reaction of genuine, virtuous chain reaction of healing and growth, spiritual growth. So I report all of the things today and all of our names here. In the name of Young and Vicky Loew, bless central family. Okay, we'll end with Song of the Garden.
Let's really prepare our hearts and our minds for the sermon today. The Lord into his garden comes, the spices yield a rich perfume. The lilies grow and thrive, the lilies grow and thrive. Refreshing showers of grace divine, from the Father flows to every vine, and make the dead revive, and make the dead revive. Oh, that this dry and barren ground in springs of water may abound. A fruitful soil become, a fruitful soil become. The desert blossoms as the rose, when the Savior conquers all his foes, and makes his people one, and makes his people one. Come, brethren, you that love the Lord, and taste the sweetness of his word. In Father's ways go on, in Father's ways go on. Our trouble and our trials here will only make us richer there. When we arrive at home, when we arrive at home.
Okay, everyone. So,
This 46
like an interesting act. Sorry. All right, so I think there's going to be a quick center meeting, right, for the residents. But lunch is ready downstairs. So Vittoria Mie prepared something. I'm sure it's delicious. And then we'll meet back here at 1 o'clock for the membership meeting. I know I sent the minutes from last week a little last minute this morning, but it's there as a reference just because last time not so many people came. We'll try to do that. We'll try to get into a habit of having the last week's meeting minutes, like notes sent before the next one. Just so if you miss one, you kind of get a sense of what we're talking about. I think the focus today is probably going to be about the Hannah room work because it's going to get started. Miwa and Deborah Hannah are going to come over, going to be kind of involved in kind of the color selection and things like that. So some of the interior design work and also helping us plan the next phases because they can kind of see things physically and have a much better idea. So yeah, so we'll just kind of talk about that and any other kind of relevant plans. There's kind of a few different things happening all at once. So, and also the Women's Fed sisters are going to go on a nice 10K walk today with the VHI kind of women's walk. So I think it's going to be Doris, Mie, Rose, Vicky, and
two other guests from.
Okay, and two other guests. So it's going to be a team of 5. So it's going to be Vicky, Mie, and Doris from our community. So we'll wish them well. Hope they survive. And they'll be fine. Don't worry, Zach. Of course they'll survive. Yeah, so I'll see hopefully some of you back here at 1 o'clock. All right, thanks everyone. Have a great week, and we'll see everyone again next week. Oh, it's Rose's birthday. That was the last thing I wanted to say. That's why I was thinking of Rose. So happy birthday, Rose, if she's on there.